In this video, I'm going to be providing an in-depth overview of how to sequence rhythmic patterns on the Machine Mark III controller. First, we're going to construct a rhythmic pattern, and then I'm going to show you how to further edit that pattern to add variation and more rhythmic interest to the part. So this video is going to focus specifically on how to change the sequence and how to edit sequences on the actual machine controller. You could always do this in the software as well, but part of the cool part about this machine platform is that you can go and edit everything on the controller, and it's definitely a lot easier to do this since the Mark III update with these added screens and everything. It makes creating more complicated sequences a lot easier. So first, let's build a really simple note sequence that we'll use kind of to base our whole pattern off of. So I just have the default 808 kit loaded up onto my machine controller. So we'll just enter a really quick kick and snare pattern. So first hit fix velocity, so that we have a consistent velocity for our pattern. Just enter in a few different kicks, then go back to the snare drum sound, and then we'll just enter in something like this. And then so far, our pattern is going to sound like this. And our project BPM is also set to 90 as well, just so you know. And just in case you wanted to edit any of these drum patterns, let's say we wanted to push our snares forward or back, you can select them via this main encoder, and then you can just push them around as well. So we could push them forward or push them backwards in time just by churning this encoder. You can also edit from these knobs along the top as well. So whenever you're trying to master note sequencing on machine, it can be a bit challenging. And for me, I think the reason for this is that if you're coming from a traditional digital audio workstation, lots of the sequencer functions are easily accessible on other digital audio workstations, like changing from 16 to 30-second notes on the grid, for example, are all hidden in various different submenus. So going back to the example that I just used as before, whenever you want to change the values in the note grid, it's not quite as intuitive as it would be with a normal digital audio workstation. So now if we do look at the software window, we can see that you could select it via this dropdown, and that's where you could change the note grid. But part of the appeal of the whole machine platform is to do everything on the actual controller without ever having to touch the software. So if you want to control this on the Mark III, it's actually hidden in a submenu. And adjusting the grid definer grid values is something that's important to create more complicated sequence. Say, for example, we wanted a 16th note hi-hat pattern to go on top of our kick and snare. So if you want to adjust the grid values on the actual controller, the way that you do that is through one of the shift functions. And that's down here on the follow button. It may be a bit hard to see on the camera, but underneath where it says follow, it also says grid as well. So to access this, you hit shift and then follow. And then you'll see this menu, which will enable us to change the grid of various different sections of our software. On the previous versions of the machine controller, this grid adjustment feature was on one of these main buttons, but they changed it in this controller. So just so you know, it's underneath this follow control. So now if we want to go in and program some faster 30-second note hi-hats, we can go over to our step mode. So just select this button to change it over to step. And then you'll see on this menu, we have several different options to choose from. We have eighth notes, quarter notes, 64th notes, 1/128 for super fast note sequences, and the various different variations on triplet notes as well. You can select these by using these different down arrows. Each of these different down arrows corresponds to one of these columns. So if I want to shift through this first column, I just use this button. Or if I want to shift through this column, I would just use this button. Or alternatively, you can also select it on the pads on the controller. So let's go back to our previous example and just do 30-second notes for hi-hats to make a quick hi-hat pattern. You can just hit this button, and you'll see that it's now changed our note grid to 1/32, which is the 30-second note. You also have the option to completely turn your grid off as well for offbeat rhythmic sequences, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So now let's move back to our step sequencer and program in a really fast hi-hat pattern. So let's go to our pads, select our hi-hat, go back to our step sequencer, and if you look closely at this interface, you'll see that it's changed our grid values to 30-second notes. You can also see this reflected in the software as well. Now let's program in a quick hi-hat pattern. So let's just do it on every 30-second note to create a really fast kind of shuffly feel. So now whenever you look at our screen, you'll see that we have these fast hi-hats on the first half of our section. As you may have noticed, we filled up all the different pattern slots on the machine pads, but we still have half of our bar that doesn't have notes yet. So what we need to do is move over to the second half of our pattern. And to do that, you can just go to this third knob from the right and turn that encoder, and then you'll see that it shifted our view over to the next half of our bar. We could then go in and program our 30-second note hi-hat pattern. So now we have an entire sequence lasting for one whole bar that has a bunch of 30-second notes. If I was to play this pattern, now it would sound like this. So by going in and changing the note grid, it lets us create faster and more complex patterns. So whenever you start to sequence more advanced patterns, and obviously you could do something that was a bit more intricate than the simple pattern that we have here, you'll want to remember that you can go in and adjust the snap to grid function, and then use the third knob from the right to shift around the different sections of your pattern. So just as default state, this hi-hat pattern isn't very exciting, other than the fact that it's quite a bit faster than what we could have previously done with the standard note snap, and it also feels pretty stiff. So let's go ahead and modify this MIDI pattern by using the variation controls on the machine controller. You can access the variation mode by hitting the variation button, and then by default you'll have to press and hold it to keep it open. So what you'll want to do is press the lock button on the upper left-hand side. So it will behave like this, so you'll have to hold down the button, and then whenever you release it, it'll vanish. But if you want to keep it locked, what you can do is press on the variation button, and then hit the button in the upper left-hand corner, and it'll lock that window, just keep it open. So the variation mode is used to really bring life to your different pattern sequences. This can also be used on melodic content as well, which I'll show you in the part on melodies. But I find that it's actually really useful, especially this humanized mode, to go in and edit rhythmic content. This enables you to easily create really complex rhythmic patterns that you can go in and then edit after you're finished, but it kind of gets things started without having to go in and edit each individual piece of a MIDI sequence. And I think that this mode is definitely really helpful whenever you start creating more complicated rhythmic patterns. So the first mode on here is the humanized mode, which can just be selected from this button on the top. This mode provides natural rhythmic fluctuations to your program sequences based on the note values and parameters that you set in this mode. You can almost think of this like a rhythmic shuffle or swing feature, but it actually affects the notes and where they're placed on the grid rather than adding an overall swing to the entire pattern. So it actually changes where your notes are placed on the grid. So the first section that we have on here is the different velocity controls. For now, I can turn off the time shift because we'll talk about that here in a minute, but we have the velocity range. So what we can see right now is that the velocity low, the lowest point on the velocity, is set to 1, and then our velocity's highest point is set to 127. This means that whenever I hit apply, it's going to randomize the velocities of my entire hi-hat sequence, or whichever sequence was selected, going to randomize the velocities of each of those different sections, giving it more of a humanized kind of live drummer feel. So let's make our settings a little bit less extreme for the sake of this video. So let's put our highest velocity down to 100, and then let's put our lowest point to 50. And then we can hit apply to apply our settings. And then if we move back to our step sequencer mode and look at our note velocities, you'll see that it's kind of randomly changed those note velocities, giving it a little bit more of a contour and switching it up so that it's not just playing the same velocity on every step. So using this mode to adjust velocity is a really great way to get your more advanced sequences started so you don't have to individually go in and adjust things. So far, our pattern sounds like this. And just to show you what it sounded like before, if I hit Shift Undo, you'll see that it's going to put our velocities back down to its default state. And it'd also be a little bit quieter because of the fixed velocity, so just keep that in mind. But listen to that kind of overall volume shuffle that we had. So this just makes our pattern sound like it was played in live. For now, we can also move into our mixer as well and adjust the overall volume of our hi-hat pattern just so it's not quite as loud. Then we can move back to the variation mode and talk about the time step feature. So the next mode on this humanized section, the time step, is used to adjust the note placement of your pattern. What you can do from this section is set a value that'll shift your notes randomly plus or minus based on this percentage that you set. This will kind of push and pull things out of time, giving it a little bit more of a live feel. Because if an actual drummer is playing something, they would give it a little bit more of a groove rather than just playing every single 30-second note exactly on the beat. So the time step can be changed from increments of 0%, from percentage of 0 up to 50, and it moves by amounts of 5 by default. And if you want to move this by a single percentage value, you can hold the shift button and it'll give you a little bit more of a fine-tuned control over how you set this percentage. So let's go ahead and make a quick edit to our pattern. Let's put the step value up to something, let's do it a little bit more extreme. Let's set it to 25 or 30. That's actually just, maybe 35 would be fine, just so it's a bit more extreme. And whenever I hit the apply button, pay attention to where the start and end of each of our notes are. It's going to start pushing and pulling things at a time. So now if we go back to the larger view on our pattern, you can see now that we have this velocity curve that was added in, and that's also adjusted the start and end points of all of our notes, kind of giving things a little bit more of a shuffle feel. And that just sounds like this. So because I had such a high percentage value on this time shift control, it's pushed things quite a bit out of time. So if you're using this to create actual patterns, you may want to go with something a bit more subtle, like 10 to 15%, just so things don't feel too offbeat. So now we can just undo that action, and then we can move on to the next mode, the random mode. Now the next mode, the random mode, randomly generates patterns or variations based on the beats and melodies that you have entered in. You can really think of this like a random note or a random pattern generator for your project. So to show how this works, we can actually remove our entire hi-hat sequence real quick. So just go into the step sequencer, and then we'll just remove all of our 30-second note hi-hats. Then we can go over and remove the remainder of our hi-hats. And then we can move back to our variation tab. So right now we have no hi-hats in our pattern, but we still have the hi-hat channel selected. And then I'm going to show you how this feature works to generate random hi-hat patterns. So the first control in here, the probability, controls the probability the note will be generated on each of the beats. So right now we have our note grid set to 30-second notes. It's set to 100% probability. That means that every single 30-second note slot on our beat grid will be filled with a note. If you set this down to a lower percentage, say 20 or so, that means that there's a 20% chance that it'll fill up each section on our beat grid. We can also set velocity ranges just like before as well. So we can set a low velocity and a high velocity. And then we can also push and pull things out of time as well. So let's move this percentage down to something about 15. Let's put the probability at maybe 60. And then we could set the low velocity to something about 80, just so we have a little bit of velocity shuffle. And then for now, don't worry about the note length or the distribution features. These have to do with how long or short your notes are, and really won't come into play until we start talking about melodic content in future videos. So we'll come back to this feature a bit later, but for now, just don't worry about it. Now, the final thing that you'll want to do is move into the keyboard mode, and then also hit the variation tab again. And switching over to your keyboard mode, you'll want to make sure that your note range is set from low note to C3 to high note to C3, and then that way it won't change the pitch of our hi-hat. Because by default, this mode can also go in and adjust the pitch of elements as well. And because we have a drum sound, we don't want it to change the pitch. We just want to change the timing and velocity of our section. So now whenever I press apply, you can see that it's generated a random note pattern down on the sequencer, and that sounds like this. And then we could even tidy up this note pattern as well by hitting Shift and then quantize to 50%. And that'll just push our notes a little bit more in time so that things don't feel too offbeat. So now the completed hi-hat pattern sounds like this. So this mode's really helpful whenever you're trying to create more complicated sequences. You can use this to start kind of throwing around ideas without having to go in and set each individual note and note velocity. You can use these two different variation modes to create more complicated patterns, and then you can go into your step sequencer and select your notes, just like you would with any other element. This can really help workflow quite a bit and will enable you to quickly create very complicated musical sequences. Alright, so that finishes up part 1 of programming rhythms in Machine. Join me in the next video where I'll be talking about how to add groove and swing to our sections, programming off the sequencer grid, as well as how to create unusual rhythmic patterns like polyrhythms. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next video.